All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I am Rosie Blewett Gulch, and we're here today to talk about the science of archaeology. So I think this will be a really great opportunity to talk about archaeology and the cool science behind it. And I'm really excited to be here with David Cranford and Kim Kenyon to talk about maritime and terrestrial archaeology. So just real quickly about myself, I am an archaeologist with the Office of State Archaeology. I'm actually originally from Boston and went to college in St. Louis and then moved here to North Carolina to get my master's at UNC Chapel Hill. And I stuck around because the area is gorgeous. And I got this great job at the Office of State Archaeology. So the Office of State Archaeology exists because there is a federal law called the National Historic Preservation Act that requires all states to have some form of state archaeology, and it exists to protect the archaeological resources that we have around the state. And Kim and David are going to get more into what archaeology is and what actually makes up archaeology. But the most basic definition is that it's the study of the human past through material remains. So unfortunately, no dinosaurs, although we do love dinosaurs, but we're just studying what people did in the past through the materials that they left behind. So I'm going to start asking some questions for Kim and David to answer. If you have questions coming up throughout as they're talking, please type those into the question and answer function, and we'll try to answer questions as we go along and save some time at the end to answer more. So with that said, I'll ask if David can introduce himself and then Kim.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is David Cranford. I'm an assistant state archaeologist with the OSA. I'm originally from North Carolina. I grew up in Wake Forest. I have always enjoyed archaeology, always since I was 5, thought that I would be an archaeologist, and thankfully I've been able to kind of see that through. I did my undergraduate work at Appalachian State University. I got a master's at the University of Oklahoma, and I finished my PhD at UNC Chapel Hill in 2018 when I joined the Office of State Archaeology. I mainly specialize in Southeastern archaeology. So I've worked in North Carolina, South Carolina, Mississippi, Texas, Oklahoma. So I've worked all over the place. And the time period that I normally work on is the late prehistoric and early contact periods, but I have a broad interest in archaeology.
Thanks, David. And Kim, if you want to give a brief intro too.
Sure, thank you. My name is Kimberly Kenyon. I am an underwater archaeologist and an archaeological conservator with the North Carolina Office of State Archaeology. I oversee, as a conservator, I oversee the conservation of all of the artifacts from the Queen Anne's Revenge shipwreck. I've been with the state for 8 years now, and I'm also one of the lead archaeologists on the Queen Anne's Revenge shipwreck project overall. So my experience, I'm originally from Texas. I went to Texas A&M University for both my undergraduate and graduate degrees. My undergraduate being in maritime studies, because I knew that I wanted to study the sea and its history. And then from there, I decided to go to the main campus to study nautical archaeology there in what is the oldest established degree, dedicated to that in the country. So that took me to a lot of different places traveling. I primarily focused on shipwrecks and ancient seafaring in the Mediterranean. And so I was able to travel to Turkey with that and worked on 2 shipwrecks there, one from the Bronze Age at Cape Galedonia and one at Kizilbrun called that sank in the Hellenistic periods of the first half of the 1st century BC. That was carrying a large cargo of marble. I wrote my master's thesis on that wreck and all the iron tools from it. And then I got the opportunity to stay in Turkey for several years leading the conservation lab established by the Institute of Nautical Archaeology in conjunction with Texas A&M. So it's a great opportunity, but mostly focused again in the ancient world. In the meantime, I've worked in Turkey, obviously. I've worked here in North Carolina for the last 8 years, and also in Texas and Costa Rica and in Puerto Rico. So this job has kind of taken me all over.
Great. And so y'all both kind of got into this a little bit, but I was going to ask first, what are some of the similarities and differences between terrestrial and maritime archaeology? They're both studying the human past through material remains, but how are the sites different, the methods? Can you give sort of a brief overview of that?
Well, for terrestrial sites, the dry archaeology, most often we are looking at places where people have either lived or worked or performed some sort of activity that leaves some sort of residue or remains on the land. So very often we're looking at artifacts that are left behind. Artifacts are just objects that have been made or modified by people. Sometimes we are looking for features, features that are the non-portable things that we find on sites. And on terrestrial sites, we're mainly looking for soil stains or rock features that are usually too big to kind of move themselves to the lab. We call those features. So we're looking for house sites or places where people have done kind of specialized processing or mining or all kinds of things that we do every day. And so on terrestrial sites, we typically see the remains of a long time, usually a long time period, and it's the accumulated debris of what people have left behind. And it's our job to pick up the pieces and try to put together a really complicated jigsaw puzzle to talk about how people lived in the past, what they were doing on a particular site, how long they were there, maybe what those things meant to the people who made and used them. So.
And then underwater archaeology is a little bit different from that, not just being a submerged environment. As underwater archaeologists, and we're called a number of things, whether it's underwater archaeologists, nautical archaeologists, marine archaeologists, it kind of hints at the same thing. And so a lot of people think that underwater archaeology is just shipwrecks and treasure. And you know, as we try to relate, treasure plays a very small role in any kind of archaeology, none whatsoever, really, at least in my experience. I'm not sure about you, David. But archaeology is mostly the study of the mundane and how people behaved and survived and used things to accomplish, you know, what they needed to accomplish in day to day. Underwater archaeology is shipwrecks, certainly. It's one of the things that we specialize in. But it's more broad than that, in that it encompasses how people through time used waterways to live their lives. So some of us may study specifically ship construction and how that changed through time. You know, wooden shipwrecks are certainly one of the most predominant because they were in use for so much longer. But it can also encompass you know, dugout canoes that we see so many of here, and certainly in the southeastern part of the country. It can encompass maritime cultures, specifically people that used and lived by the sea, you know, and waterways, you know, as their just main life. It can be the study of ports and how and why they came to be. It can be the study of trade routes through time. So it really is just, you know, how people use the sea to their benefit in a lot of different capacities. Shipwrecks being one of those capacities. And certainly now we see even the study of airplanes and, you know, from the 20th century, you know, looking for these lost planes that were downed in World War II. So it is really growing as we move forward into the future.
Kim brought up a really good point about for so much of archaeology, we're studying the trash about that people left behind. I think people often have a glamorized view of what archaeologists actually are looking for, the treasure, the gold, the really cool artifacts. And while we certainly are excited when those occasionally pop up, I'd say 90% or more of what we find are the broken fragments of the everyday objects that people used. In my case, we find broken fragments of pottery sherds that sometimes we can glue back together and get a sense for what the original vessel looked like, but very often we're finding just fragments. We're also finding stone artifacts, usually not the whole complete arrowhead or spear point, because those often get used until they're broken or no longer functional, and that's when they get thrown away. So we often see the things at the very end of their use life or when they're broken, and the things that we find are the things that are very durable. We tend not to find, at least on terrestrial sites, things that break down and rot, things that are made out of organic materials and things like that. So if you give an archaeologist a trash pit, he or she is a very happy archaeologist. We can learn a lot about how people lived based on what the trash they left behind.
Yeah, exactly. And shipwrecks kind of are slightly different than that, because they usually were lost inadvertently. Generally no one intends to sink a ship unless they're attacking it, or it runs aground. So whereas a terrestrial site may represent a really long occupation, you can kind of understand, the hope is to understand how that culture evolved over time and their uses and their behaviors and things. Shipwrecks are much more of a time capsule of a moment in time, and so we're kind of looking at it in a similar way. These things were disposed of, but why? Why was this ship lost? Where was it going? Who were these people? So we have kind of different questions surrounding a shipwreck site than you would kind of face on a terrestrial site.
Just going to jump in real quick. I forgot to mention at the very beginning that we are recording this session and we'll be posting it online later once it's been processed. So just so y'all are aware. And having said that, moving on to sort of another question y'all bring up. How do you find sites on land and underwater? And especially, what are some of the technologies that you use to find those sites?
For terrestrial sites, there are a variety of ways that we find sites initially. And one of the more common ways is that folks tell us where the sites are. There are folks who, like farmers, who are out on the land, people who inadvertently discover artifacts on the surface and they report them to our office. And we actually do have a citizen science site recording form that we really recommend people use and let us know where the sites are, because that's very helpful. In other cases, when we don't know where a site is, or if there are any sites, we usually use a survey strategy, and that can vary between just walking a plowed field to using aerial photography or remote sensing, things like ground penetrating radar or magnetometry, which kind of measures slight variations in the Earth's magnetic fields. So we use a variety of ways to look for evidence of where people have lived and worked. And depending on the kinds of sites, we look for different things. In many cases, we are looking for artifacts on the surface, but sometimes we have to dig down into the ground with shovels and use a wire mesh screen to look for the small bits of artifacts that we might not see if we just dug a hole and looked at the dirt. But there are a variety of strategies that we use to find sites.
And again, in the underwater world, it can be slightly different. I guess historically, the most reliable way that ships were found, particularly in the Mediterranean where I worked, was with fishermen and sponge divers reporting things that had come up in their nets, or things that they had seen. So some of the most noteworthy and amazing shipwrecks that have been discovered in the world were thanks to sponge divers. Now, since we know that we have such a rich global underwater history, and we know that there are a lot of shipwrecks out there, a lot of people will survey certain areas, looking for submerged sites. So this is done primarily in the first instance using a couple of different technologies, both magnetometer, as David mentioned, to look for magnetic or metallic objects on the seabed, which often indicates that there is a man-made structure, whether it's something that has sunken or a shipwreck that's been lost. So that's one way in which wrecks are found. The other most common one is by the use of side scan sonar. And that takes a profile of the seabed, and it can pick out features in the bottom of the sea that are proud or that stick upright out of the sand. And so also indicate that there's something else down there besides just a flat seabed. So those are really common techniques. Other than that, sometimes we just have to put divers in the water to take a look. So if we suspect that there is something down there, we'll deploy a dive team to go actually look at it. Sometimes just laying your eyes on something is the most reliable way to do that. Depending on how much money someone has to spend on surveying, particularly for very deep water wrecks, then you'll see the use of remotely operated vehicles to look for sites. We at OSA don't have that kind of funding. So we kind of stick to shallower sites and mostly sonar and divers in the water now to locate those kind of wrecks in state waters.
So once you find those sites, how are you actually excavating them and bringing up any artifacts or recording them in place?
Sure. That's a good question. It usually depends on the questions you're asking. Most archaeology is driven by the questions we ask, and whatever strategies we use to excavate a site is usually dependent on why we're digging the site. If this is done for compliance purposes, under the auspices of the law that Rosie mentioned at the beginning, or whether this is done for purely research, it kind of depends on how you approach the site and what kind of questions you're interested in answering. But generally speaking, sites, once they're located on land, you want to know how big the site is, what kind of site this is. Is it a house site? Is it a processing site? So you're looking at the kinds of artifacts that are likely to be associated with one of those activities. You also, generally speaking, want to know how old that site is. And so most often you will start by doing a shovel testing survey to put small holes kind of spread out systematically across a site, where you're digging kind of a small hole with a shovel, and you're taking all the dirt out of that hole and putting it through a screen so you can collect all the small fragments of artifacts, and you're mapping that to see just how big the site is. Once you kind of know where the hot spots, where there's the most artifacts, or if you encounter any soil changes that you weren't expecting from a natural soil progression, you can target those areas with an excavation unit, or usually a square hole, where you dig down very carefully in layers, recording as much as you can what you see and what you find. So much of archaeology is recording the sites as you see them, knowing full well that what we do on an archaeological site is destructive. We are in a process of controlled destruction of a site, and it's our kind of responsibility as archaeologists to document that as best we can, knowing that nobody can come and dig a site exactly how it was when we first got there. So we take pictures, we take notes, we draw maps, we take samples, sometimes soil samples, sometimes the artifacts, specialized samples like flotation samples to collect food remains, burnt animal bones or plant materials. So it's all of those things are usually dependent on the questions we're asking, but when we start excavating in those block units, we are trying to really discover the context in which all of those artifacts are found, not just the artifacts themselves, although those can tell us a lot. It's usually their relationship to all the other artifacts on a site that really tell us the most. And so we take very good notes on exactly where artifacts are found from a site. Usually we can tell you exactly within sometimes centimeters from where they were found, so that we can help reconstruct what was going on at that site.
If I can jump in for a second, we also take some really interesting photos and can stitch together back images of the excavations. I don't know if you want to speak just briefly about our Sketchfab site.
Yeah, so one of the really new technologies, and it's a new technique based on relatively regular technology. We can take digital photographs and create a digitally processed 3D model, a highly detailed and accurate model, 3D model of artifacts and archaeological excavations, where you can collect sometimes hundreds or millions of points that you can then measure after the fact once you're on your computer back in the lab. This is a really cool technology, and all it's based on are digital photographs that are all overlapped and use a computer program that finds common points from different perspectives and can create this 3D model. And it's a very cool process. And the Office of State Archaeology has a digital library of some common artifacts and some of our recent archaeological excavations. And we can put that probably down in the comments section, and it's at sketchfab.com.
Yeah, so as far as underwater sites go, and David was mentioning documentation. So that is really what makes archaeology science, that collection of evidence, that meticulous attention to detail, that ability to be able to reconstruct what we are essentially destroying, and put all of that data out there so that it's not just something that we know, but something that we can share and we can prove, and that helps other people understand different sites that they may discover. So that is really what makes this entire discipline of science. And of course, we have the fun technological toys that that we can apply to that as well. But in underwater archaeology, it's a very different game. You know, mostly when you're approaching a submerged site, it's the first question you ask is there a need to excavate this? Excavation and the ensuing conservation of materials from any site, terrestrial or underwater, is an expensive venture. And once you remove something from its burial environment, it undergoes irreversible changes that we have to then correct, that we have to, you know, to help and to prepare for exhibit and to do the right thing for the collection. So first and foremost in underwater archaeology is asking, you know, is it necessary for us to remove this because of the expense, because of the ethical obligation that you have to the collection long term? But is there a specific research question that this ship may be able to answer? And then we, you know, with the same kind of thing that David was talking about, we may do a small sampling of artifacts from a site to establish the date, hopefully an identity. Unfortunately, in underwater archaeology, it's actually very rare to be able to associate a ship with a known event or identity. Most wrecks throughout time are anonymous. But so we collect artifacts to understand the date, the size, hopefully the nationality, and then, do a lot of research into, if it's in the historic period, into did anyone document the loss of this ship? And then we may decide to fully excavate. So once excavation begins, it's like I said, it's a really expensive venture. There's a lot of logistical planning that goes into it. You need a ship from which to dive. You need a crew to captain, to crew that vessel. We need divers, qualified divers to help us be able to excavate. We need all of the equipment. We need a facility to put all of the artifacts in. Once they've been raised, artifacts from a marine environment it's very critical that they're cared for appropriately. So that is all taken into consideration. But once we actually start to excavate, that is, really the fun part. We similarly use a grid system to plot out a site so that everything can be referenced to each other, and we don't move anything, we don't pull anything up until it is photographed, drawn, measured, fully documented where it came from on the site. Like David was saying, to retain those relationships so then we can better understand the site and how it all comes together. And how it has fallen apart. A lot of that information as well helps us understand the impacts the environment has played on the destruction of a ship, how it's become an archaeological site. So all of that is relevant information that we collect. Our tools are a little bit different. Obviously, we use scuba. We're very cautious. Health and safety is number one on a shipwreck site because you're in kind of a foreign environment. So we work in buddies. Many of the sites that I've worked on, we've had some kind of underwater communications where maybe you can't see each other, but we'll have communications in our masks so that we can push a button and actually talk to our fellow divers if it's not the best conditions to be able to see each other. And we can talk to people on the barge, so it just ensures that extra level of safety. The tools to actually excavate are quite different. We may use trowels and things as well, but our main tools are those which help us remove all of the sediment that in the water column to help us get down to the actual wreck layers. So primarily we use something called a water induction dredge, which is kind of a fancy way of saying it's an underwater vacuum. We use water forced through a pump and a pipe to create a suction, and that suction helps us get rid of all of that overburden of sand. We can also use that to collect sand if we suspect that there are really small artifacts in it. And we do this a lot on our own site on Queen Anne's Revenge, collecting that because we know there are small things that we can't see in such a poor environment. So that's not uncommon. We also may use something called an airlift, which is a similar concept, but using air pumped through a pipe to create a vacuum. So really it's that removal of sediments. And then we may get down to where we can actually see large things, and those get mapped in the same as they would on a terrestrial site. But it's all driven by that need to collect every bit of information about a site as you're pulling it apart. So it's same concept, driving the activity, whether it's wet or dry.
Some of the tools that we use on terrestrial sites can vary between a backhoe to a dental pick, and it's all really driven by the situation that we're in. Sometimes we use backhoe or a mechanical shovel to remove lots of dirt at one time if we're trying to get to a specific level of the soil. Once we encounter archaeology, a lot of times it can be very fragile and delicate, and we don't want to use really the heavy machinery. So we will switch to shovels of various sorts. And when it comes down to it, we use a hand trowel, just a mason's trowel to help move the dirt out of the way, to expose artifacts so that we can get them out safely, document them as they are. And in some cases, we use dental picks and brushes for very detailed work on things that may be preserved that need extra care. So it really depends on the situation, which tools you use. We also sometimes use a shop vac to get up the crumbs before we take a picture. So archaeologists like to use the tools of a lot of other disciplines, a lot of other sciences, because we're opportunists.
Yeah, we're really good at adaptation.
Yeah.
So you guys have talked about how sites are not always sort of what you'd expect them, or we don't always find the big sort of exciting things that you think of with archaeology. Do you have like a favorite type of site that you dig up, or something that you've found and been really excited once you realize like, oh, this is what I'm looking at in the field? Cool artifacts.
Kind of to drive home this point about how most of the time we are not finding the exciting artifact. When I was doing my first field school, learning how to do archaeology in the field, I was tasked, I was told to clean this 1 meter by 1 meter square of dirt down to a specific layer of the soil. And it happened to be a woodland period mound, an earthen mound site that had all kinds of artifacts in it. It had broken pieces of pottery, had stone tools, had charcoal, had all kinds of things. But as I was cleaning this particular unit, my trowel popped up a large kind of clay mass. And as I cleaned it off, I realized that this was a piece of fired clay, just a piece of clay that had been thrown into a fire. But as I cleaned it up, I wrapped my fingers around it. It fit my hand in a way that I realized that this was a piece of wet clay that someone had in their hand, squeezed it, and left their fingerprints and marks on their hand, and then thrown into a fire where it had kind of preserved that shape. And for the first time, that was really a moment where I realized that this was an actual person. I could see their fingerprints. It may not have been a very exciting artifact, but it really was a connection to the people who I was trying to understand. And so that was a very cool moment for me.
That's really cool. The fingerprints are really awesome. I think my kind of the most memorable moment I have is the same. It was my very first summer in the field as a student. It was my first venture into underwater archaeology. And I was working on the marble carrier in the Aegean, that was, again, Hellenistic in age, so over 2,000 years old. And in addition to carrying 50 tons of marbles, also had an array of ceramics that were likely held contents that the crew would either use themselves or were trading. So I was assigned to a specific square. It was an amazing site because it was very deep. It was 150 feet, but the water was clear as glass. And it was just a beautiful site to work on, and it's still to this day my favorite. I have very fond memories of working on that shipwreck. But I was assigned, I think, as a first-year student, a unit that was kind of, assumed to be barren, so that I couldn't mess anything up really. So I was, airlifting away and sucking all the sediment away, and realized all of a sudden that I had hit something that we kind of had thought was a rock. It had a lot of marine growth on it, and these things have been under the water for 2,000 years. So there's a lot of it blends in with the rest, and that site was very rocky anyway. And I kept removing sediment, and realized that once I got down, it was really smooth. And so I cleaned it up and realized that what I had discovered buried underneath all of this seagrass, and that these various fish were living in and around, that I had found an intact amphora, a really a nice early form of storage jar that were really commonly traded, and particularly on ships, because they came to a point, they came to what's called a toe, that could be stacked in the hold of a vessel. So when I found this, it was one of those moments that I'll never forget. We got great photos of it, so I have evidence of it as well. But it was that first moment of discovery, and when I reported, like, I found this amphora over here, this is really neat. We actually had to move the datum. The datum was sitting right on top of the neck. And we thought it was a rock. So that was I'll never forget that moment, and that kind of really cemented my excitement of working in this field, of that discovery, and like seeing something for the first time. And that jar turned out to be, even though our shipwreck was in the Aegean, that jar originated in the Black Sea. So again, spoke to the intricacies of trade routes, even in that period of time, even 2,000 years ago, of how much exchange was going on across long distances using ships like this. So that's still my favorite discovery, I think, my fondest memory.
Super cool. Okay, so we've talked about finding the artifacts, getting them out of wherever they have been sitting for 1,000 years. What happens next? You take things out, and what happens to the artifacts after that?
Yeah, so as you can imagine, excavation is one of is usually the most exciting part of doing archaeology, but it's usually only the beginning, and it usually ends up being a small fraction of the time that you spend investigating a site. Often we talk about fieldwork being for every 1 day in the field, you're spending a week or more washing the artifacts, cataloging the artifacts, describing them, doing all the various analyses, trying to understand what those objects can tell you, and then doing the reporting. The really essential part of doing archaeology is to make sure other people know about this, not only other professional archaeologists, but the public. Make sure that we can communicate this and make it meaningful to a broader audience. Some of the things that we do on terrestrial sites, with artifacts that usually come into the lab in the paper bags that they are put into when we are screening the dirt, and so we take them from the plastic or paper bags. We wash all the artifacts, keeping the artifacts that were found together so that we can trace, and we make sure we keep that context intact. We usually wash them very carefully, let them dry, and then we sort them based on their material type. And then we describe what we found. At that point, once we have all the artifacts cataloged, counted, weighed, measured, we can start considering some of the specialized analyses that we might want to do. Things like X-ray fluorescence spectrometry. We can do things like residue analysis or blood residue analysis on tools. There are a variety of kind of specialized analyses that we may do if we have specific questions that might get addressed by doing those things. But for the most part, for terrestrial sites, the artifacts that we tend to find most often are fairly stable. They've been in the ground for a very long time. They're things like potsherds and stone flakes or stone tools. They don't require a lot of extra care to keep them stable. Sometimes when we have metal objects, we have to do a few extra steps. But for the most part, the things that we find most often are fairly stable objects. So.
Yeah, and then on the other end of the spectrum is the artifacts from submerged environments. We'll certainly everything gets documented first. It's photographed, it's weighed, it's measured, and it's stored away. But even more, and certainly research is a long-term goal. We try to understand as much as possible. We plan for the same kind of analysis that David was mentioning, elemental analysis. We've even looked at bone material at an isotopic level to try to understand where that individual specimen came from, so determining their origin. So there's a lot of analytical tools at our disposal to better get a better picture of a site and what all of these things can tell us about a site. So that's relatively the same, research and analysis that's always at the forefront. But I would argue even more critical to submerged sites is conservation. So once that comes up, and this is true of any site, once an artifact is deposited, it's kind of reached a stasis at some point. There's a lot of decay that happens. And then it kind of reaches an equilibrium with its burial environment. So once we pull something out of that, it will start to degrade again with the exposure to air, to light, to moisture. It will kind of reset degradation. So we really have to step in as underwater archaeologists. And luckily, I'm able to bridge that gap between archaeology in the field and the conservation lab to know exactly what needs to happen next. So artifacts generally from a marine site have to stay completely submerged. So once we remove them, we always have tanks of water, little containers sitting around the deck of the boat for an excavated artifact to go immediately into. So we keep them wet. For most things, because they've been waterlogged for so long, if you let them dry in an uncontrolled manner, it can lead to a lot of disasters. And that's true of even, things like David was saying, like lithic stone objects and ceramics on submerged sites. If they dry out very suddenly, that can be very, very detrimental to those objects. So first and foremost in conservation is, working with the field team for appropriate storage measures in that instance, and having that ready. Once they get back to the lab, then we can start to assess what they need next. So everything stays wet. Generally in conservation, we have to remove all of the salt, and then each different material type undergoes a lot of different processes. So that can be a whole other webinar in conservation. But yeah, conservation is very, very critical to archaeology because of that imminent threat of loss. And we're doing all of this hard work. So the last thing we want to do is do something that will destroy all of our evidence. Then what was the point of excavating in the first place? So kind of a different track there, but like David was saying, certain objects from terrestrial sites are equally as critical to get correct conservation planned for. But I would say across the board, that cannot be overlooked for submerged sites. That really is the next important stage that everything goes through, is proper care, proper storage, active treatment, and then a controlled drying at the very end of that. And conservation can take years and years and years. If we raise a cannon, for example, from a site, it will be fully covered in concretion or this thick crust as the iron corrodes in a seabed environment. And so we have to remove all that crust and then address the iron that's underneath it. So a cannon, from it to go from the day it's excavated, and if we start working on it immediately until the day that it's dry, you're looking at 10 years easily in a conservation lab, so that it can be safely dried and then safely exhibited. So that's why, again, there really has to be a need for excavation, and the funding and the facilities, and is there a legitimate research question behind raising this material, because it is a long-term commitment by the archaeologist and the conservation team and a curation facility to store these things, so that they can be properly cared for.
Awesome. David, I know you mentioned blood residue analysis and X-ray fluorescence. I was wondering if you could both talk just briefly about sort of what the cutting edge type of analyses are that we do, and sort of what new information we've been able to find about where things came from, and based on some of the newer science we've been applying.
Sure. There are a variety of ways that we can look at artifacts, both chemically, elementally, microscopically. There are all kinds of approaches to artifacts that can tell us a lot about how they were used, what they were made out of, where those materials came from originally, can tell us about human interactions and trade routes. So some of the techniques that I've used and I've been around have been, I mentioned X-ray fluorescence, and what that, it kind of looks like a Star Trek phaser.
Tricorder, basically.
Yeah. But what that instrument does, it sends out a high energy beam of X-rays, which when they interact with the elements in a particular artifact will reflect and refract that beam, and based on the elements present will give off different energy signals, which the detector can look at. Basically, it's a very powerful flashlight that emits X-rays instead of visible light, and so we use a computer to look at the different amounts of elements, so that we can figure out if, and for instance, if a metal object is made out of brass or bronze, that can tell us about the process of production of that artifact. In some cases, we can look at the elemental, the trace elements in a piece of stone to know, did it come from a quarry in this part of the world or another, and that can give us clues as to how that object ended up at this particular site. We have options. There are people who specialize in looking at residues from ceramic vessels. They can look at plant residues and animal lipids, the proteins that are found in food or other things that people are using at a site. We have a collection of stone spear points in our office that have been subjected to this blood residue analysis to look at the invisible, otherwise invisible traces of the animals that were killed and butchered with those tools. And that helps us understand, even though bone usually does not preserve very well in the southeastern United States, we have very acidic soils. Moist soils are not great for organic materials, even some bone. So in the absence of those kinds of lines of evidence, this can be a really powerful tool to understand how these tools were used in the past. So there's a variety, and I know I'm only hitting a few, and I'm sure Kim can talk about a few others.
Yeah, there's so much we can do now, you know, with the advent of new technologies. We're always looking at different sciences that can be applied to archaeology so that we can learn the most about our collection that we can. So recently, let's see, yeah, XRF, as David mentioned, the X-ray fluorescence, we have one of those in our lab, and it's a fun tool. It's a lot of fun to use, but it's great in helping us if we can't automatically recognize something, you know, because especially if something's been buried for so long, it's not always clear what it's made of. So that will help us determine, you know, is this object silver? Is this copper? Is this iron? And that helps us not only with the archaeological identification, but that helps us as conservators make the best decisions as far as conservation treatments, because those are very, very different treatments depending on the different material. So that's a good one. We use X-ray very regularly. X-ray is a great tool. It's, you know, everyone is kind of knows of it. It's kind of one of the, I guess, hate to say basic, but it's one of the more basic technologies that we have available to us, but it's one of the most helpful and diagnostic tools that we have to see through that thick layer of crust, to see what objects are underneath. But also we can pick out maker's marks. We can pick out designs in those objects that we may not be able to see otherwise. We can, you know, see damage that maybe a person has caused. So that's a powerful instrument. We've done recently, we found leather from our site. So as David was saying, a lot of artifacts like organic matter may not survive very well in the soil because of the acidic nature of the soil. And generally they don't survive very well in an underwater environment like we have found offshore here, because it's warm, there's a lot of bacterial activity, and it's heavily oxygenated. So those things will rot and decay away just as easily in a submerged site. But if they're found near an iron object, we get pretty good preservation. So we have found wood, we found quite a lot of bone material, so animal bones that were left behind by the crew. And we have found pieces of leather that were part of either footwear or clothing. So what we've been able to do in the case of the leather is take a sample and work with a lab who can then extract the collagen from the skin and characterize it to tell us what animal that came from. So we found, cattle and pig most predominantly. And then with the bone, similarly, we've taken samples of bone and sent them off to a lab to identify the origins of those specific animals. So where along the ship's route were those animals loaded? Did they come on in the beginning? Were they in the middle somewhere, or were they, toward the end of the voyage? So those are some of the things that we've been able to apply to this collection. But the same thing, we can look at residues that are left behind. Pitch survives pretty well in marine environments. We find that not only on the hull remains as a form of waterproofing, but in some of the more ancient sites that I'm familiar with, they'll find it in the actual storage jars to line the jars. So you can pick out the pitch and identify the lipids in that, but sometimes it will even retain pollen, so you can understand what kind of plant material was interacting with either the vessel or that container. So there's a lot of, there's so much potential for learning about a collection with this microscopic evidence. So it's again why we take such care in excavation and documentation and in collecting samples, because we can then learn much, much more about a site than we otherwise could just by kind of looking at it with our eyes.
One of the things I forgot to mention was all the dating techniques. One of the kind of key questions in most archaeologists' minds are, how old is this thing, or how old is this site? And we obviously have radiocarbon dating on things that have organics, things that were once alive and took in the environmental carbon isotopes. So we have ways that we can date using that method. We have other methods that look at sand grains and how they interacted with light or heat. That's thermoluminescence or other things like that. So we have a broad array of tools that and in a lot of cases we've borrowed from other sciences, or we lean heavily on expertise from other fields to help us answer the questions that we're interested in and understanding. So in most cases, a typical archaeologist is not going to be able to specialize in all of these different methods, but we really rely on colleagues and specialists who kind of can tell us those and both provide that information and help us understand what that can tell us.
So as we're getting sort of towards the end of the hour, I wanted to finish up by talking about how people can get involved in archaeology at all ages. So if you've got younger children that we're talking about, if there's archaeological sites they could visit, or good museum exhibits or resources, and sort of talking about ways people can get involved if they're interested.
I know for me, I knew that when I was 5 years old that I wanted to be an archaeologist. That doesn't happen all the time. Some people find archaeology later in life, sometimes as a second or third career. But at any stage, if you're interested in learning about the human past and how archaeologists do what they do and how we learn what we learn, there are a lot of ways you can do that. You can visit museums. You can visit, we have state parks and state historic sites here in the state that help understand not just the deep human past, but the historic past, which archaeology can still tell us about. Places like Town Creek Indian Mound, Mora Mountain State Park, or any of the historic sites that we have here in the state. In terms of seeing archaeology, there are state archaeological societies that you can join as just an interested person who wants to learn more. You can visit ongoing excavations wherever they are. If some archaeological excavations are easier to get to than others, but you can always ask questions of the archaeology. So I think, Kim, you can you can pick up where
yeah, it's the same, look for those open houses, events. We have events all the time, or as much as we can. We hope to have more in person once we get past this year, hopefully. But look for those opportunities to get into that environment. We take volunteers pretty regularly. They have to be of a certain age, and they're lab-based volunteer placements. But we'd love to be able to kind of give people that hands-on experience. We work mostly with undergrad and graduate students, but we also try to, as much as we can, get into your elementary schools and your junior highs and high schools to talk about what we do. So to share our job, because that got us all inspired as kids, is hearing about someone else's experience. But certainly, as if you decide that's the track for you, look for those opportunities that you can volunteer on. Visit historic sites, talk to your local archaeology offices and societies and see how you can get involved. Email us, ask us questions. We'd love to field those kind of questions. And then, once you kind of get further on into that in your higher education, certainly look for internships and volunteer opportunities as much as possible, to really see if this is right for you. But yeah, we encourage everyone to just email us, just contact our offices and see what you can do, how you can get involved, how we can come to you if you're an educator or a parent, and talk to your kids and see, just learn about what it is that we do and what that entails and how you go about accomplishing that as a job.
When you are in college, getting ready to, if this is something you pursue as a career, most often archaeology can either be found in an anthropology department or a classics department. It kind of depends on, there's a traditional split between kind of New World archaeology and Old World archaeology, but you can also make sure you're taking classes in history, and we've already mentioned that we rely heavily on some of these specialists. There are a lot of successful people who kind of bridge archaeology and anthropology to other sciences like geology, biology, chemistry, physics. All of those things can help inform archaeologists in different ways. So don't be afraid to look beyond anthropology, but that's usually where I started from, anthropology.
Great, thanks so much, y'all. I think we'll wrap it up at that. We are very happy to be participating in the NC Science Fest. It's a great event to get to learn about all kinds of cool science careers. We've had several blogs posted throughout the week on our social media page talking more about the science of archaeology. David and Kim have both at various times written blogs and articles and other things that can be found on our website, giving more educational information. And we have home activity packets and all kinds of fun stuff online. So we hope you'll continue to join us as we do archaeology throughout the state. And thank you again very much to David and Kim for sharing your perspective today. All right. Thanks, y'all.